Pam Reynolds experience. In 1991, Pam Reynolds was about to undergo brain surgery to remove an aneurysm. The procedure was so delicate that her body was cooled to an extremely low temperature, causing her heart to stop. As her consciousness faded away, Pam was catapulted into a limbo state where reality warped and time seemed to drag. She found herself floating above her body, observing the frantic medical team. The fluorescent lights shone intensely, but the light seemed not to illuminate anything. It was a palpable darkness, as if a veil of terror covered everything. Looking down, she saw her own body, lifeless, surrounded by shadows that moved silently, as if they were malevolent entities feeding on her life force. Pam heard the doctors discussing, but their voices sounded distorted, as if echoed through an endless tunnel. Then, Pam was pulled into a dark tunnel, its walls pulsating with familiar faces. Loved ones she cherished, but were now covered in pain and suffering. The whispering of their names was deafening, a lament that echoed in her mind, growing in intensity and despair. An invisible force dragged her deeper into the darkness, and a sense of dread overwhelmed her as she realized that each step took her further from the light. The terror intensified, and when Pam finally screamed for help, she felt icy hands grip her, pulling her toward the void. When she awoke, her heart raced, and she realized that the other side was not just a place of peace, but a trap for those who hesitated. Tony Kikoria's vision. Tony Chikoria, a respected orthopedic surgeon, was on the phone in 1994 when he was struck by lightning. The impact left him in a coma, plunging him into a state between life and death. During this time, Tony had an experience that blended beauty with utter horror. He found himself in a vast universe where colors were so vibrant they seemed to explode in his vision. But at the same time, a deep, oppressive darkness began to form at the edges of his sight, like a predator waiting to pounce. As he explored this dimension, he encountered ethereal beings dancing around him, but as he drew closer, he realized their faces were distorted, reflecting his deepest fears. They smiled, but their eyes were empty, like black holes absorbing the light. As the celestial music filled the space, the darkness closed in, engulfing him in a shroud of terror. He began to hear whispers, the voices of beings seemingly lamenting over him, demanding that he join them. The fear paralyzed him, and he found himself pulled into the void, where an endless abyss awaited. He struggled to return, but each time he approached the light, an invisible force pushed him back, as if the shadows wanted to claim him. When he finally woke up in the hospital, the feeling of being watched haunted him, and the music and shadows never left him. Dr. Eben Alexander's nightmare. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon, fell into a coma due to a bacterial infection in 2008. During his near-death experience, he was launched into a dimension that blended celestial beauty with absolute terror. He found himself in a bright, vast universe where light and colors danced in harmony. But this serenity quickly unraveled as darkness began to spread around him. He saw flashes of his life, each memory shrouded in a fog of regret and pain. Those he loved, who appeared in his thoughts, wore distorted faces as if the suffering they carried was manifesting physically. The environment began to spin, and he realized that shadows were watching him, each with malevolent intent. The figures were indistinct, but their eyes glowed with dark knowledge. As the light began to flicker, Dr. Alexander found himself in an internal battle where the darkness promised power and knowledge, but at the cost of his soul. The shadows, once mere figures in the corner of his vision, began to advance, trying to capture him. He screamed for help, but his words were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the approaching abyss. Finally, as he cried out for a second chance, he awakened in the hospital. But the feeling of being trapped between worlds never left him. The dark entities seemed to follow him, whispering in his ears, threatening to drag him back into the void. Anita Morjani's nightmare. Anita Morjani was terminally ill with cancer when she had her near-death experience in 2006. In her comatose state, she was transported to a dimension that seemed filled with love and light, but soon transformed into a nightmare. As she floated in a brightly lit space, Anita felt indescribable peace, but that serenity quickly unraveled when darkness began to spread around her. She saw flashes of her life, each memory enveloped in regret and pain. Those she loved, appearing in her thoughts, had distorted faces, as if the suffering they bore was taking on physical form. The environment began to swirl, and she realized the shadows were watching her, each with a malevolent intent. The figures were indistinct, but their eyes glowed with dark knowledge. As the darkness closed in, she felt her deepest fears being exposed, and the sensation of being consumed by despair enveloped her. She struggled against the pull of the darkness, but she was being dragged into a vortex where lost souls screamed in agony. Finally, as she decided to return to life, Anita awoke, but the darkness never left her. Nightmares became a part of her existence, and the whispering voices haunted her in every dark corner, ready to pull her back to that terrifying dimension. Maria's descent into darkness. Maria, a 35-year-old woman, was driving home after a long day at work when a speeding car collided with hers. The impact was so severe that she became trapped in the wreckage and was declared clinically dead at the scene. She was taken to the hospital, where doctors attempted in vain to revive her. While her body was being treated, Maria found herself in a dark and misty space. Initially, the experience felt like a dream. She floated, free from pain, in a kind of void. But soon, this freedom transformed into a terrifying nightmare. The darkness thickened, and shadowy figures began to emerge, enveloping her like a sinister shroud. These shadows moved rapidly around her, whispering in a language that sounded like echoes of pain and despair. Maria tried to understand what they were saying, but it felt as if they were debating her fate, as if they were judges of her soul. Panic took over her, and the sensation of being watched became unbearable. The shadows, increasingly visible, had distorted faces and hollow eyes that reflected her own mortality. A deep, resonant voice echoed in her ear. "You do not belong here." Upon hearing this, Maria felt her heart freeze. The darkness began to close in around her, and the shadows held her with invisible chains, pulling her toward an abyss forming at her feet. Every movement she tried to make was in vain. The harder she struggled, the stronger the force that kept her trapped. With one last desperate burst of energy, Maria screamed for help, a plea that sliced through the void like a blade. At that moment, she was abruptly thrust back into her body. She awoke in the hospital, gasping and in shock. However, the feeling of dread never left her. Whenever she closed her eyes, the image of the shadows haunted her. She knew that something was out there, patiently waiting for her, and the darkness seemed to draw closer with each passing day. Kevin's haunting encounter. Kevin, a 21-year-old young man, was battling his inner demons. After an overdose at a party, he was declared clinically dead for several minutes. During that time, Kevin had an experience that would haunt him forever. He found himself in a dark and cold corridor filled with old wooden doors, each with deteriorating paint and deep scratches. The air was thick with a rotten odor, as if the very corridor was decaying. As he cautiously moved forward, the echoes of screams and wails began to fill the space, an agonizing sound that made his skin crawl and his heart race, The voices coming from behind the doors were those of lost souls, pleading for freedom, while others sounded tormented, banging against the walls and crying out for help. A particularly disturbing sound stood out. The cry of a child, its voice sharp and desperate. Kevin felt an urge to open the door, but the idea terrified him. He knew that opening that door could mean facing something he couldn't comprehend. One door creaked open slowly to his left, revealing a brightly lit room, but the light was cold and sickly, as if draining the life from everything around. He hesitated, but a force pulled him inside. Upon entering, he felt a chill run down his spine. The walls were covered in shadows that seemed to writhe and move, and a dark presence materialized behind him. When he turned slowly, he saw a tall, skeletal figure, shrouded in a black cloak, with eyes that glowed like embers in a fire. This entity stared at him intently, and fear washed over him like a wave of ice. The figure whispered his name, and Kevin froze, his heart racing. He realized that this entity knew all his deepest secrets, his fears and regrets, every failure he had tried to hide. It offered him a choice: remain in the land of the living, where his struggles would continue, or open the door to eternity, where pain would no longer exist, but darkness would reign. The choice was clear, yet the thought of joining that shadow was horrifying. Kevin fought against the entity's allure, but the feeling of being consumed by absolute despair pushed him to the brink. With one last scream of anguish, he decided to fight back and attempted to escape the figure's grasp, but the darkness seemed to intensify, as if the corridor were closing in around him. Finally, feeling the entity's presence closing in, Kevin awoke in the hospital, sweating and trembling. The sensation of being watched never left him. Since then, he felt a constant presence, as if the entity were always lurking, ready to claim him. Nights were the hardest, filled with nightmares that led him back to that corridor of doors, always unsure of what he would find behind each one.